In 1932, Winston Churchill stated, "If we look back on our past life, we shall see one of its most unusual experiences is that we have been helped by our mistakes and injured most by our sagacious decisions." Now that word sagacious is not a word we use often. So let me restate this line with a word that is more familiar. If we look back on our past life, we shall see one of its most usual experiences is that we have been helped by our mistakes and injured most by our knowledgeable decisions. Churchill's observation may be more correct than we are willing to admit. Sometimes what makes sense, what eliminates the most risk, what we have researched the most, what seems appropriate and wise, may harm the most. And the things we fear the most, error or mistake, may actually help us in the future. When I read this line from Churchill, my first feeling was discomfort. You see, I'm a planner. It's in my DNA. I like to try and cover every possibility, every possible outcome of a decision. I even like to try and answer every possible question when putting together a presentation. It's part of the reason I have such an affinity to Paul's writings. This approach seems reasonable, seems to contain preparedness, seems safe, seems wise. It just feels right. It reduces risk. After all, God gave us a brain and we should use it, right? That's true. But sometimes we can think our way right out of faith. Fear can overcome faith and reason can thwart trust in God. In those times, Churchill's words, "We are injured most by our knowledgeable decisions," come true. As I thought about Churchill's words, I suddenly thought about two generations of Hebrews. One followed Moses and another followed Joshua. Each were faced with the same objective, the Promised Land. God had brought each generation to the edge of the Promised Land and told them to take it. It was faith versus fear, trust versus reason. The first group was following Moses. Moses chose 12 spies to infiltrate the land and determine the bounty in the land, the terrain, enemy strongholds, and the strength of their armies. They came back with their report. "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them." Now, not all the spies agreed. Two saw things differently. They looked at the fortifications and the size of the people and their armies, and they still realized that God was bigger. So they wanted to go in and take the land, but they didn't win the argument. The well-reasoned, wise, safe, it just feels right group won the argument. And as Churchill observed about life, they were injured most by their knowledgeable decision. This takes us to the followers of Joshua. This group of Hebrews were born wandering in the desert for years. Why? Because their parents had won the well-reasoned, wise, safe, it feels right argument years before. Now they and their leaders, Moses, had all passed away without setting a single foot in the Promised Land. The only two left from their parents' generation was Caleb and Joshua. Joshua was leading them now, and Caleb was more than raring to go to take that land. And by the way, they were the two that wanted to go in the first place because they knew God was bigger than the enemies they faced. Back to the story. God tells Joshua to cross into the Promised Land, so he and the people do. To do so, they had to cross the Jordan River. And guess what? It was at flood stage. Not a good plan. More on that in a minute. Then God told them that they were going to conquer a city named Jericho. It was well fortified and difficult to conquer with a great army. Actually, God said he was going to deliver it into their hands. But here's what they had to do to accomplish that. They had to gather the army together and march around the city for 6 days, one time each day. Then on the 7th day, having 7 priests walk ahead of the army, they were to carry the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant in front, And then those priests were to also carry ram's horns to blow. The armies were to follow them and march around that city 7 times on the 7th day. After the 7th time, the priests were to blow their horns loud and then have the people shout, "And the walls will collapse," said God. "Then take the city." Okay, now most of you have read the story. You know the story. I've read the story over and over, as have you. We've read it so much and even heard it as kids so many times that it doesn't seem strange. It seems normal, but it's strange. If I'm in Jericho looking down from a position along the fortified wall, I'm thinking, these people are nuts. Who makes up a plan like this? It's not reasonable. It's not wise. It's not safe. It doesn't feel right. It feels crazy. But it's what God said, and it's what Joshua and his followers did. They learned from the mistakes of their parents. Remember Churchill's statement? If we look back on our past life, we shall see one of the most usual experiences is that we have been helped by our mistakes. So, they crossed the Jordan at flood stage. Not reasonable, not wise, certainly not safe, and it didn't feel right. But it was about faith, and God parted the waters and they crossed safely. Their army marched once around the city for 6 straight days. Not reasonable, not real wise, not safe, nor did it feel right. Kind of takes away the element of surprise, don't you think? But they did it. Then on the 7th day, the priests went out with the ark and the ram's horns, and the army behind them, and they marched around the city 7 times, and the priests blasted the horns, and everyone shouted just as they were told to do by God. Doesn't seem real reasonable, doesn't seem wise, doesn't seem safe, and it doesn't even remotely feel right. I mean, it's weird, crazy, and nuts. That's not how you fight a battle. But it was God's plan, and they trusted him, something their parents mistakenly failed to do. The walls fell down, and they sacked Jericho. They won a battle against some of the very people their parents reasoned were unbeatable. So what's the lesson? First, there's nothing wrong with a well-reasoned, wise, safe, it feels right plan. But if God's call to us has us doing something that doesn't seem reasonable, wise, safe, and it doesn't feel right because it's all about his glory and our faith in him, then we should choose God. You see, sometimes faith doesn't make much sense. Sometimes it calls us to risk. It calls us past the place of concern for mistake or error to the place of total dependence upon God. The second generation remembered their parents leaned on their own well-reasoned judgment. They took the wise and safe path, and it felt right. It was the greatest mistake they made. It cost them the promise God had given. They learned from their folks' mistake, and they placed their faith in God, even when it seemed like a weird plan. They believed and conquered Jericho, and they finally entered the promised land.